War in the Middle East. Over the weekend, the US and Israel launched strikes on Iran, killing the country's supreme leader and other senior figures, and of course, with it, countless number of civilians. Within hours, Iran responds, missile attacks across the regions, widening the conflict beyond its own borders to its neighbours in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. Air defences have been activated across the Gulf, oil markets are reacting, and rhetoric on all sides is escalating. Welcome to Put Simply, the podcast that puts what's happening in the world simply without compromising on the details. Erdem Koch is my name, Rodney McCune and Ozan Ibrisim, as always, my co-hosts. Gents, starting with you, Ozan, let's take a step back. On the last podcast we did, the question we posed was, is war with Iran imminent? Turns out the answer to that question was yes, but take us through what has happened in terms of the strikes that the US and Israel have inflicted on Iran and Iran's response and where we stand today before we try to make sense of this mess.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. On the last episode that we covered Iran, I think we're all of the view that it's certainly possible, but something that we're seeing unfold in front of our eyes now was probably unlikely. But I guess much of our judgment, certainly mine, was based on the fact that one would hope that there would have been a better kind of way to resolve this situation. And we're going to get to what the situation actually is. But as you correctly pointed out, US and Israel forces together launched a significant attack on Iran on Saturday mid-morning local time. During that attack, it was later reported that the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, was killed, along with a number of the very senior security officials, government officials, including also the Minister for Defense. So it was a quite striking blow, and one that obviously everybody expected Iran would retaliate against, and they certainly did. And many of us probably have friends who are either going through the Middle East or maybe living in Dubai, Doha, and other places. Many of them experienced a significant, kind of, well, they had a very bad night, I suspect, because Iran not only attacked the army bases in that region, but many of the missiles that were kind of aimed and targeted at different civilian buildings, such as airports, etc. Hotel, I believe, in Dubai was hit, which I believe was hit from some of the remnants of the interceptor missiles that had intercepted the drones that were, or the missiles, the ballistic missiles that were kind of fired from Iran. So it's effectively chaos and mayhem. And there are many reasons, I guess, that have been put forward by the administration. Perhaps we can dissect some of them. Firstly, the administration claims that Iran poses an immediate danger to the US and its allies. They haven't been able to actually articulate what that danger is, because if you listen to any expert, they are all, unanimously of the view that Iran is very far off, particularly after last year's strikes, very far off actually developing a nuclear weapon. So that's number one. Of course, the concern has always been Iran attacking Israel. Again, Iran has no proxies left in Lebanon. Hezbollah's basically been reduced to a militia group that's running around with machine guns. Most of their capacity has been completely destroyed in the last year or two. So the administration has brought as a justification for these attacks a number of things which are clearly not true. They haven't had congressional approval. It's against the international law to attack a sovereign state without some form of process. So one can only deduct from that that Trump is President Trump is basically doing Benjamin Netanyahu's bidding, and is pretty much following the Israel agenda on this. And Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in the last couple of days said it himself. It's not even anybody else saying it. He said it himself that he has been wanting to destroy Iran and the regime for 40 years. So it's an ill thought out attack. There are no plans beyond what happens when the Supreme Leader and many of the senior government officials are killed. There is no exit strategy. There is, it's almost laughable the way that Trump is encouraging Iranians to go and take over the government. Last time I checked, Iran, people don't walk around with M15s or AR-15s like they do in the US on the streets. The only people who are armed in most of urban Iran are the security forces. And you don't have to look very far to see that just a couple of months that those security forces, when they are pushed and when they are backed into a corner, will go on the offensive and respond in the most horrific ways. And I'm, of course, referring to 20, 30,000 people, according to estimates, who were killed during the most recent protests against the regime in late January. So I think we have found ourselves in a very chaotic, very worrying situation with no coherent plan or any kind of coherent strategy beyond bombings for the next 3 or 4 weeks.
Rodney, let's pick up on why this has happened. As Ozan mentioned, Israel has had the motivation to seek regime change through force in Iran. The US has been warning about Iran developing a nuclear weapon which would threaten Europe, its bases in the region, potentially even the US. That supposedly was destroyed, or the nuclear facility supposedly was destroyed earlier in the year. Why now? And what's the motivation between Israel and the US to effectively now start a war, which, as you correctly pointed out on the last podcast, was going to be very difficult to contain to the borders of Iran?
Yeah, but I didn't get right that it wouldn't happen, which is what I was probably rather optimistically hoping for. Look, the starting point is when America did what was their Operation Midnight Hammer or something called, when they did this super long flight and this precision bombing and set the Iranian nuclear program back by decades, and Trump said it was the greatest military operation in history. And Iran posing an imminent threat to regional or global security by the production of nuclear weapons at the beginning of 2026. Both can't be true. So either the US and Israel lied when they said the program had been set back and it was an outstanding success, or they're lying now in terms of the pretext for war. And it's very clear that the current attack happened, and it was an attack by Israel and the US on Iran. I know there's been other things happening in the region, and Israel hasn't really stopped with low-grade taking of life in Gaza and in Lebanon. But they're obviously had a very big prize in seeing the opportunity to topple a leader in Iran who had been an adversary over a very long period of time. So, there's many reasons why this may have happened at this particular time. There's some suggestion that it was brought forward and therefore the talks didn't reach their logical conclusion because there was an opportunity to remove the head of state. And it's also very clear that Israel and the US are attacking different targets, as if it gives the US some sort of moral distinction from Israel, who's attacking and looking to kill senior figures within the regime, where the US is saying that they're going after the ability to fire missiles and other things, and therefore there's some sort of distinction. One goes in hand with the other. They're both supporting each other in this, and that's why when we come on to discuss the UK, I think it's a much more complicated picture. But there's suggestions that this is a news distraction from the more information coming out in the Epstein files, so therefore some sort of wag the dog. But I don't think so. I think basically Trump's taking his foreign policy direction from Israel, has been for some time. The questions Americans and certainly those in MAGA might want to ask is why? Why has the Israeli government got such a hold over the direction of US foreign policy in such an obvious way? Because it doesn't look as if America is thinking independently. And what he's done goes in contrast with other things that he's done, other things that he said, especially in terms of um, um, uh, wiping out or setting back for decades the nuclear program. And he's also very clear, as is Hegseth and others, that they have no plan to manage the situation post-conflict. Ozan's 100% right. There is no alternative government in waiting. The idea that the son of the Shah will return in some sort of white steed, having been the son of someone who had ruthlessly repressed the population themselves, and perhaps the experience of Andrew Mountbatten, Windsor, should remind people that the favoured son of a former monarch might not always be the best choice as a future leader. So I don't think that that's realistic. There is no alternative. If the government does collapse, Suzanne's also right that there's not people ready to step in. What you have is inevitable armed conflict, a little bit like what happened with Libya, which still hasn't resolved, and the net consequence of destabilizing a government that no one would wish to support um, is that, like in Libya, spilled over into the Sahel, arms flowed into there, fighters flowed into there, destabilized other governments, Chad, Mali, Niger, etc., and also accelerated smuggling and people trafficking into southern Europe from northern Africa, because that became a free space for criminal gangs to operate in. So there could be many unforeseen consequences of this. It clearly hasn't been thought through. I don't think it's directly related to the midterms, although being at war and being successful potentially in a conflict might give some small boost to Trump, especially if it's a righting of the wrong of Iran over many years and what it's done and so on. But and of course, there's an attempt to paint those who aren't necessarily in favor of this military action because it hasn't been thought through, because it's not part of a greater plan, etc. As well, then you must be in favor of the regime and the late Ayatollah or whatever it happens to be. But I just think that this is going to be something which isn't going to be finished in days, and this is going to drag on, and Iran's going to continue to attack infrastructure. They've thrown the cost of energy up immediately. They're attacking ships. They have a capacity to continue to do things, even if it's not necessarily to attack with any great ability, significant Israeli military or US targets to stop their ability to continue to launch strikes and so on Iran. I just think this isn't going to go away very quickly. I think not having a plan of what next, and the capacity to suck in regional players is just going to make this all very, very difficult over the coming weeks. and we're going to see a lot of civilian lives lost. And then you ask yourself, to what end? So yeah, it's a terrible situation. There's a number of rationales that have been put forward. None are particularly clear, and no doubt when the conclusion comes, and depending on what the conclusion is and what happens, people will start to write the narrative of their thought process at that point. Potentially, it'll be good politically for Trump. Who knows? But I think that's going to have a lot of things over the coming weeks fall his way.
It's very hard to comment on Iran. You know, none of us being an expert, not a lot of people being an expert on Iran in the West, given that it's been such a closed book for many years. But Ozan, touch on the significance of the removal of the supreme leader from power and most of that senior leadership, and also Trump claimed that by crippling the regime in Tehran, that the Iranian people will now have their best chance in generations to take to the streets to seize power. He had said at the time, you know, that take over your government, it'll be yours to take, and this will probably be your only chance. I mean, surely it's not as easy as that, right?
No, it definitely isn't, and you don't have to be an expert on Iran to understand some very basic realities about the country. And you know, I think what I neglected to say earlier was, you know, I don't think there's anybody who isn't happy to see the back of the supreme leader. The regime in Iran is horrific. I have many Iranian friends, and we spend hours talking to them amongst ourselves about what a great country Iran could be if it wasn't governed by this regime. And you know, it is a great victory for the people of Iran to see the symbolic head of this regime, you know, being taken down. And I'm saying symbolic, and I'm going to underline that word because there are some very basic facts. Yes, the supreme leader is the supreme leader, etc. But he has been there since 1989. The revolution was in 1979, and for the last 45 years, Iran has built one hell of a security apparatus, an interwoven system of army, security forces, the Republican Guard, which is effectively the kind of special elite unit who reports directly to the supreme leader, I believe. So there are many people still who have every interest to continue this regime. In fact, many of them now, you could argue, have a lot more justification to even make the regime more brutal, make it even more kind of you know, against what most of us would want to see, or the direction in which we would want Iran to go. You know, I was listening to a few experts talking about it yesterday, saying that it would not be surprising if there are a number of factions now within the Iranian government and you know, the ruling class that you know, want to double down on an atomic bomb, because you know, the irony of all of this is if Iran had nuclear weapons, this would not have happened, and that's the irony of it.
100% Ozan.
So
100%.
you know, that is completely the irony of all of this, because they're trying to stop Iran from having a nuclear weapon. If they did, do you think Trump would have had the courage, or you know, to go ahead and do this? No, I don't think so. And look, one of the things that really bothers me about this administration and this MAGA movement is they believe that they believe that they are the kind of holders of all wisdom when it comes to this sort of stuff. President Trump knows it all, etc. But you know, most people should ask themselves why, for the last 30, 40 years, we've had consecutive administrations, Democratic, Republican, who have not taken a step like this. And the answer is very clear. The answer is they were advised by people who actually knew what was going on in Iran, who had an idea of what's likely to happen if you take a step like this. And, you know, and at the end of the day, common sense prevailed. But of course, Trump He and his supporters and this administration, they don't listen to experts. They don't listen to advice. And they want headlines. They're acting at the request of Netanyahu and Israel. And I've got to say, I mean, Israel has become a rogue state, and unfortunately, the way that this issue has actually been handled, the US is also on its way to becoming a bit of a rogue state. You have somebody in charge who's not listening to the advice of experts, and effectively nobody around him who will say no when he goes off and does this sort of thing. And again, I want to highlight that in theory, the regime in Iran falling would be an amazing thing. But there's a reason why it hasn't happened for 40 years, because they have a tight grip on control. They have a tight grip on the security apparatus. They have a tight grip on the state's ability to kind of, I guess, control its people through violence. And nobody's thought that trying to break that without a plan was at all a great idea. So we are where we are. It's not a surprise that we're here today with a Trump administration. But I don't think that there's not much of an exit ramp from where we are.
Why did Iran retaliate, Rodney, against its neighbours in the region? We said at the outset of the bombings and the missiles that's been intercepted in Saudi, in Qatar, in the UAE, in Bahrain. Is this Iran was saying that it will target US military bases, but obviously with the interception of missiles, we've seen, attacks or I guess the outcome of attacks in cities that were once thought as safe havens, particularly in the UAE. What's the thinking there?
Well, look, there's always been, there is a history, right, between Iran and some of its proxies and the Gulf Arab states. So, although relations have been better or improved in recent months, there's never been a great degree of affection. So I think that's the first point, which is very important. And therefore, it's okay for Iran to do that. But also, Iran doesn't have the capacity potentially to strike American targets anywhere else than in the region. So if they limit themselves by not responding against American targets in those countries, well, then they have very little to respond to at all. They have the capacity to attack ships in the Strait of Hormuz. They have the capacity to try and get Hezbollah to do something vis-a-vis Israel, but they don't have the chance to respond to America. And the calculation is that by taking American lives, the war or the action of Trump will become unpopular enough early enough in the US that the US will have to stop what they're doing. And that has been, albeit in much longer conflicts, the experience of anywhere that's found itself at the wrong end of American intervention, whether it be in Afghanistan, whether it be in Iraq, whether it be in Vietnam, and I'm sure there's many others I could add to that list pretty quickly, where eventually, with the loss of life, with no clarity around outcomes, the American population become disinterested, distracted, and against the continuation of conflict. Now, obviously, it would take a long time for the Iranian situation to get to that point where there was significant loss of American lives. But I do think that that is part of the calculation, and but also reminding those in the region who permit America to have bases that their permission or acquiescence in what America is doing is something which shouldn't go unchecked or unresponded to. So I think there's probably 2 points to it. I also think that they've probably had an established list of targets which they've just actioned, and obviously the political calculations. Maybe there's an erosion of the capacity and thinking around that because of the removal of the leadership so early on by the US or by Israel, supported by the US, and therefore it's a military response rather than necessarily a thinking response. But I suppose there is the prospect of some of those neighboring countries pressurizing America to take a step back or to slow things down or to wind it down, because they're finding themselves experiencing um, Iranian offensive action, which is maybe costing lives and infrastructure within their own countries. But once that starts and the pressure to respond becomes um, significant on the likes of Saudi Arabia, for example, we look at the blockade with between the Saudis and Qataris, or the rest of the GCC and the Qataris. It took years for them to take a step back. Look at Yemen and how long that was allowed to continue for, with Emirati and Saudi involvement there. The idea that these situations will just dampen down suddenly once there's been Saudi lives taken or Emirati lives or any of those other things will be very difficult. There's also especially in relation to the UAE, where there's probably the greatest hostility with Iran, because UAE is seen to be closest of all to Israel. The Dubai and Abu Dhabi prosper because of their ability to attract, um, in part because of their ability to attract foreign talent, expats, etc., etc., as a very easy place to live, low tax, good employment opportunities, investment from foreign companies, the liberal part of the Middle East, perhaps from a Western perspective. It's not such a pleasant place when people are scrambling at airports to go back to their home countries, or their European governments are advising them to leave at the first opportunity. That will be an experience that may cause longer term economic shock or disruption to some of these places. Who knows? But Iran has responded quickly and in as much force as it can. I know people have criticized their action in relation to the rest of the region, but I'm not sure that they would be any worse off at this stage. Again, early days, had they not done so. And if it does mean pressure in the US to wind things down, well, that's probably a good outcome for Iran. And of course, America having removed the supreme leader in joint action with Israel, can simply say, well, we've done that bit. It's up to the Iranians now. If they don't want freedom and opportunity to change the shape of their country, well, then we'll be back in 12 months to do the same if anyone decides to action a new missile program or enrich uranium. Who knows? But yeah, I'm not surprised by what Iran has done by way of response. And there's potentially partly driven by circumstance, but there is a rationale behind it as well.
You've both touched on domestic matters, and Ozan, I want to come to you on what this is going to mean for Trump. I mean, it's no secret, and Rodney, you've outlined it so well, about the complexity of the region, about the history lessons that arguably haven't been learnt when you think about Iraq and Afghanistan, and then of course Libya and other nations in the region as well. But I mean, Trump came to power on an America first, pro-peace sort of promise, right? And what now, 7 foreign countries that he's ordered strikes on and removed leaders on, and sort of these open-ended conflicts that are now taking place in his second term only. And it's what, 12, 13, 14 months old. What now happens from a sort of a MAGA Republican support perspective, particularly leading into the midterms? Because although his base, I guess, is still relatively holding strong for now, we are going to see the cost of oil. We are going to see potentially the snowball effect that will have on inflation, not only in the US, but across the entire Western countries. This is going to have massive ramifications, and surely Trump is not going to be immune from that.
Yeah, look, it's uncertain because it'll be judged by where this lands rather than where it started, and loss of American life, whether it's going to be something which actually produces a positive outcome in terms of what the successor government regime looks like in Iran, how long the conflict goes on for. There's too many uncertainties to say what the impact domestically will be. And of course, yeah, he did say no more forever wars. And that was part of what they campaigned on in America First and so on. But I think what we're seeing is the emergence of a new form of economic imperialism, and a clarity that they're not trying to export democracy and American values around the world. What they're trying to do is ensure compliance, or rogue states that take direction from the US, so that economically and defense-wise that they're in some sort of alliance. Trump and the White House give no care in any way whatsoever for the freedoms and human rights of the people in Iran. It's just not in any way relevant to their thinking. What they do care about is a trading relationship with Iran, what relationship Iran may have with China or Russia, and how much favorable agreements they can extract from a more vassal state Iranian regime, which is what they want to get to, not dissimilar to what happened in Venezuela, which of course is something which is in part emboldened the White House to support or allow the lead to be set by Israel, but them to follow. Where it impacts on other international relationships is something different, and you can see that there was a very different response from the Canadians and the Australians, in contrast to what Starmer in the UK said. But even then, the UK is now being sucked in to saying that they'll allow America to use bases in order to attack missile sites, because that's ostensibly a defensive action. And the Labour Party in the UK, I heard Mike Pence on something yesterday lamenting the inability of the UK to continue to support the special relationship. It seems to me that those in America must have some, surely, appreciation to how they're perceived under Trump too, by those outside America. The idea that people will just follow blindly is deeply misguided, and at some point that may start to cut through domestically, and perhaps that's another aspect of how Trump and this action will be judged in the long term, on relationships with historic allies and friends and so on, that he's done so much to damage with tariffs and other things in the first year of his second term, and now doing so again by going off and yeah, even acting unlawfully. I mean, where's this going to land with Congress? There was no approval for any of this military action. It does feel very much like the weapons of mass destruction stuff around Iraq, and I can see why in the UK Labour has had that very much in mind in terms of how they've not jumped to attention and to support American action. Um, yeah. So sorry, I got it slightly off domestic and went international, but I see that as related to domestic as well, because the fact that we don't know a lot of these things is because we don't know what the outcome is, because nothing's been defined. But it is a new era of America. I think you said is on his way to becoming a rogue state, Ozan. It's certainly becoming, rather than the world's policeman, the world's bully. And that's not particularly attractive either, because it's going to encourage
Well,
people to forge new alliances, to seek, to seek sanctuary and shelter, with Russia, with China, with other people that America won't want them to go and seek support from. It's yeah, it's none of this is great.
yeah, no, look, I was just going to say, I think, Rodney made some very good points. I think, in terms of the domestic component of this, we know for a fact that foreign affairs rarely has huge impact on domestic politics in the US. However, that changes very quickly, and we've seen that in the past when the US is in a war that its people don't understand, and they don't appreciate, and they don't really can't relate to, particularly when fallen servicemen and women start to come home in body bags. This is something that is very, very disturbing for most Americans. And I think, there were some polls um, recently, I think 1st of March, so very early on in the conflict. 52%, this is a Washington Post poll, 52% oppose the strikes, 39% support them, and 9% are uncertain. But the most relevant thing here is that the same poll found that 2/3 of Americans think that the administration has not clearly explained its goals. And 3/4 are concerned that the US is getting into a full-scale war with Iran. So all of those sentiments in the electorate that helped Trump with certain segments of the electorate, helped him to get elected, particularly around, ending forever wars, etc. Those sentiments still exist, and that's why it's a very risky game that Trump is playing domestically, because the problem he has is this is not Venezuela. This is not a small place. Through the actions of Israel and the US, we've now suddenly seen 7 or 8 other countries being pulled into the conflict. So, there's a very high chance that from here on, Iran will not sit down at the negotiating table and try and come up with a solution, at least not for a long time. So this is starting to smell like it could be another, maybe not a forever war, but a very, very long war, and one that's going to continue on having, inflicting casualties of, US casualties, other casualties, of course, civilian casualties. The optics for this are not good, particularly in the lead up to a midterm elections. So I don't think, as I said, if he had a plan, if it was going to be, or if the administration had a plan, if it was going to be a very, very brutal strike, and then there was a plan to kind of bring everything together and try to come up with a longer lasting solution, then I'll say maybe there might be some political upside for him. But there is no plan. I mean, it's typical Trump administration. There is no plan. They've bombed. They've killed the supreme leader, and now they're talking about regime change. I believe again, some of the experts are commenting that the only 2 times that regime changes happened through airstrikes was once in Serbia 30 years ago during Milosevic's reign, And the other time was in Japan. That was one hell of an air raid. It was the dropping of the atomic bomb that changed that regime and ended that. So if you look at the kind of track record of regime changes via airstrikes and an air war, there aren't too many examples to point to. So the question needs to be, like, if he wants to get some really resolute kind of conclusion to this, then the administration is going to have to consider putting boots on the ground. And I believe there have been hints that it is on the table. And, boots on the ground open a whole new can of worms, I think, politically, particularly with a country and a MAGA base that is really, really against this sort of thing. So I think it's high stakes poker for him. He's taking a huge gamble, and let's see if it pays off.
Well, and as always, the brunt is borne by the people it affects directly on the ground and the civilians. And we're already seeing reports of children killed in schools because of Israeli strikes and whatnot. And it's a sad and difficult time, I think, for the world. But gentlemen, thank you so much for attempting to put it as simply as possible this week. See you next.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.